Back to Religion of the Apostles. May God bless you. We are celebrating a feast of the Apostles this evening. The Apostles Olympus, Rhodian, Sosipater, Erastus, Quartus, Tertius, and was there another one? I think that's it. It's about 6 of them. I always thought Jason was in that group, but I guess not. Jason and Sosipater, maybe that's why. But we are going to be looking today at chapter 8 in Father Stephen DeYoung's book, The Religion of the Apostles. We have worked our way through most of this book, so we have only 2 chapters left. But the bad news is that we're going to take our time and we're going to read through it gently and carefully. So this chapter, as you'll see, is God's people Israel. It's a very important chapter for establishing our kind of understanding of ecclesiology in the New Testament church, the understanding of that going forward. And so if we look at the outline, you can see that it's got many sections to it. We're going to basically tonight just address the introduction to the chapter and kind of do a quick look at some of the themes that we're going to look at throughout the whole chapter. So this is a kind of a reset. And really if you look at the book, I think we're just looking at like maybe the first 3 or 4 pages of the chapter tonight, essentially. But he packs so much stuff in there without really going into detail that I thought it might be useful, because he can just drop, a huge long slew of citations of verses from the New Testament without much explanation, assuming that you're going to go back and do the homework. But most readers aren't going to go back and do the homework, and I figured, well, this is why we're here. We're going to go and so why is he including those things, and why are they important, and what's going on behind the scenes? So that's our topic for tonight. And really what we're looking at because of that, our main focus today will be on how is Israel understood by the time of the first century and in the New Testament, in the apostolic, the religion of the apostles, right? So that doesn't mean that, thank you, welcome. That every aspect of Israel is inaccurate or is wrong or something like that, but just by that first century period, what were the ideas about what that meant, and what were the expectations of what Israel meant? And so if we look at the name and the place, of course, Israel begins not as a place, but a who, a person, the holy patriarch Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham, right? He's about 4,000 years ago, a long time ago. And so the first person named Israel is Jacob. Then his descendants are called Israel, or the Israelites, and that's a term that's used throughout. And you even see St. Paul describes himself regularly as an Israelite. I'm not going to go tonight into what's the difference, but why use the term Hebrew versus Israelite versus Jew. We'll touch a little bit on that, and it'll hopefully unravel over the course of this chapter. It also means the land in which his descendants dwelt. So it becomes synonymous with a place. Later, it becomes very specifically a kingdom. You could say that Saul's kingdom is kind of called Israel. So the Davidic kingdom you could call Israel, but what happens after Solomon is that the kingdom divides to north and south. And the northern kingdom continues to be called, at least in the scriptures, the northern kingdom. And in the south, it's primarily the land of Judah, so it's called Judea. Becomes the kingdom of Judea, or the kingdom of Judah. Later, you could also talk about after the exile, for example, Israel becomes more of a kind of a ethnic term for the people who were displaced, who share a common culture, language, and faith. They also have that before that, but once they're out of the land, then they continue to be Israel elsewhere. And then, of course, you have the modern nation state of Israel, and one of our students just came back from the nation state of Israel and the Holy Land, and got to visit many of the sites there. All of these things are at different times and different histories completely fine and appropriate uses of the term Israel. The thing is that when you get finally to the New Testament, the understanding of what Israel is to become in the eyes of the apostles is not really any one of those things. It's actually something inclusive of those, but more than those. And that's a big part of what we're going to look at through the course of this class. Now, basic Bible history again. I'm sorry if this is a review. I know you're all pretty smart. Hopefully, you've read your books of the Pentateuch and then Joshua and Judges and so forth and Kings. But in case you're not remembering all of that, I just wanted to show you a quick little timeline. Can you see that okay? Is that good? That's big enough for everyone. So Israel, of course, as I said, starts with Jacob and his descendants. And then you could also say united people group that came out of Egypt, right? Free my people Israel, right? And so Israel becomes reconstituted as a group of people centered around that faith and culture and language and so forth. And that is the beginning of the entrance, the Exodus, and then the entrance into Canaan. The dates here sometimes are different based on the Septuagint. If you ever notice that, is like 480 years to this or something, and other Septuagint says 440. The only difference is Septuagint is just numbering from the end of the Exodus than the beginning. So the period of the Judges, for example, to the time of David is like 480 or something like that from Exodus, but 440 from the entrance into the Holy Land, the end of the Exodus. Not that that's very important, but when we talk about Israel as a kingdom, it's really only a unified whole for about 120 years. But it still obviously carries this powerful significance and symbolic power even to this day. But this is actually very frequent and very common. I think of my own ancestors coming from Romania. Romania was, for most of its history, if not independent, it was part of other empires, and for a period, most of it was 3 different principalities, 3 different regions, and it was only brought together as one unified kingdom for a short period in the I think around 1600, and then broke apart again, and then didn't really become a unified nation state until 150 years ago or something like that. So we think of these things as like they've always existed, but if you ever go and look at a map of Europe with a time lapse, you see how the borders are constantly shifting and constantly moving. Even Ukraine, for example, we're making there a lot about the war in Ukraine right now, but Ukraine as a nation state is a very recent phenomenon. It's historically been, even though it's had its own maybe ethnic and linguistic and cultural aspects, as a polity, is a very recent phenomenon in the history of the world. And so the kingdom of Israel as its own kind of unique nation state really only has this short period from Saul through Solomon, and then that divided kingdom happens. The northern kingdom, even though it took the name of Israel and it represented most of the tribal lands, as we'll see in the next slide, was primarily known as the Ephraimite kingdom, because the tribe of Ephraim was kind of the immediate northern neighbor to Judah and was one of the largest, most populous regions. It was also known as the House of Omri in the records of the surrounding kingdoms, because they didn't care about what you called yourself. They cared about who were you dealing with. And the king Omri was one of the most notorious kings of that land. He's not a Bible hero by any means, but he was one of their most established kings. So in a lot of the records of that period, we see the House of Omri being described. So again, places have different names based on who's telling the story, right? Who's telling the history. That kingdom only lasts for so long. Let's see, 952 to 720. So that's about 170 years or so. Is that right? Am I doing my math correctly? Because it's BC, so it's backwards. So 130? 230?
Oh, yeah. 721.
230, yeah. You're right, 230. See, I knew I needed some help with that. The Assyrians come in and conquer that region, and they deport most of the people to a region within Assyria. They don't deport all of them, kind of obviously, as they never really do. They deport the ones who have the most power and wealth, who are at the greatest risk of being a problem for them politically. Just like the Babylonians will then do a couple centuries later with the exile to Babylon. They don't take all of the Jews to Babylon, all the Judeans. They leave clearly a fair amount of people there because then they come back and they find people there. So this is why you still see Israelite peoples in the northern areas like Samaria, Decapolis, and so forth, because those regions still had heavy populations of people that remained there. And again, Judah, the southern kingdom, lasts to about 586, and then there's the Babylonian conquest. That's 70 years of exile, and then they come back. It's never really the same. It's always after that pretty much a client state under the Persians, the Syrians, the Greeks, and then the Romans, right? So it's never really its own independent polity at that point. But all of these things could be called in some way Israel, right? Or they would have identified with that name and with that lineage throughout all that time period. If we look at it geographically, we can see how these borders shift. So for example, this would be in around 1000 to 1200 BC, so 1,000 years difference to the time of the first century. Some of the same things kind of line up slightly, but not perfectly. So Judah, now they always say that Judah and Benjamin were the southern kingdom, because like Benjamin is tiny down there. Simeon somehow got lost in the 10 lost tribes. So the 10 tribal areas that get conquered, really it's more like 9 up here, get conquered, become known as the lost tribes of Israel. It's not that the people themselves disappeared, or one of them named Lehi boarded a ship and went to America and started the Mormon church. Sorry, didn't happen. But there is these areas of self-rule and self-contained Israelite peoples are lost. That region, the people, many of them again are still there, but the rulers, the nobility, the rich people, the powerful people, they're all exiled and taken out of there. Yeah.
My recollection is that Levi does not have its own territory. It's distributed throughout.
Yes.
And,
so you have Manasseh and Ephraim split.
But what I was going to say is that Levi, and there's also Levi in Judah and Benjamin.
Yeah, the Levites never have a territory of their own. Sometimes they have, like, I think cities or something like that, but settlements. But for the most part, they dwell in all of the areas because they're there to do the priestly ministry to the people. And of course, their line becomes increasingly truncated in the lines of the high priests, which eventually become the Sadducees in the time of Christ as well. So that group still continues to play a role. But all of these tribes are still there. Like it's not like those lineages died out and those people were gone forever, but rather their holdings were lost, so to speak. So you still see people from all these different tribes in Judea, for example, but also in places later like Samaria, Galilee, Decapolis, Perea. Perea is an interesting. Most of us have heard of Samaria and Galilee, right? If you've paid attention to your New Testament, I'm sure you've heard of Decapolis. Decapolis means the 10 cities. And so it says that Jesus went about the area of Decapolis preaching and so forth. He sent the 70 apostles into the 10 cities area and so forth. Perea is really just Transjordan. And that's what it means, is based on the Greek word from across the way, basically, across the river, essentially. And in fact, that may actually be the original meaning of the name Hebrew. The original name of Hebrew may be, the word might come from the root to cross over or to pass over, which of course will make the connections there with the Passover, but also the people that passed over the Jordan coming in. So this region is certainly part of that heavily populated area where you have Israelite descendants and so forth like that. So, with Israel means? So Israel generally is translated as what? Struggled with God, right? Because Jacob wrestled the angel, and the angel was overcome, as U2 sang in Full of the Blue Sky. So I always remember that verse. But yeah, so Israel struggled with God. It's an interesting name to make that the name of your chosen people, right? It's kind of like knowing you're going to fight with them, it's kind of anticipating it, and that's what we're going to see that as we look forward. Okay, so this land is of course very important. It's the most hotly contested real estate in the history of the world, perhaps. It's right at this kind of the intersection of three continents, so it's strategically extremely important. It, compared to some very arid areas around it, tends to be a lot more fertile and green. Not always, but it has water and rivers and so forth. So it's a beautiful territory to be in, and heavily desired. But by the time of Christ, mostly what we're talking about here is Judea is the main area, but then Christ is way up here in Galilee, and there's obviously Jewish settlements, what they call, by this point, Jews, Hebrews, and Israelites is kind of all synonymous. However, there are some times where you will see in the New Testament, when, especially in the Gospel of St. John, which is written later, when John says the Jews did this or the Jews did that, he's usually being actually very specific to Judeans in the sense of the people in the south. He's reflecting the kind of a broader, maybe Hebrew identity, and when he says the Jews, he's not trying to attack like all Hebrew people. He's saying the politically powerful people of Judea caused all these problems for our people, our group. And so it's when we talk about all this history, we have to be very, very careful to discern what's happening in the scriptures and disentangle it from a very long and complicated history of conflict between Christians and rabbinical Jews, of people from all over the world with anti-Semitism, not just Europeans, but in the Middle East, in Africa, and so forth. So there's a whole complicated history there. So I just want to make sure when we talk about these things, we're actually trying to use them in context and understanding them. Okay. So we're coming up on Christmas very soon. We'll start the Nativity Fast. Next class is November 15th. Yeah. What do we? Ask me after class.
What was the question?
What do we do about Thanksgiving?
Oh, okay.
All right, but ask me after class. I don't want to have to record that on tape because people might have different ideas. So we hear about Judah and Israel in this sense that there is a distinction between the two in the Gospel of Matthew from at the very beginning. So Matthew is quoting Micah or paraphrasing the prophecy of Micah, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So he's paraphrasing Micah 5:2, which in both Septuagint and in Masoretic basically reads this way: but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting, or from ancient times or ancient days. So it's an interesting passage because it can be kind of understood as a fulfillment of the Messiah prophecy, but in particular, when you look at Micah, it includes this aspect of the one from of old, from everlasting. You remember, if you go back to our earliest classes, we talk about the expectation of the Messiah. There is this idea that he would be this figure that was somehow pre-existent, that he is from the beginning of time. We see that in the Enochian literature. It's kind of hinted at in Daniel, the Son of Man, and all that type of stuff. But there was certainly by the first century an expectation that the Messiah was coming, and he wasn't just any guy. He was somebody who had always been. And if you want to really blow your mind, you can watch this little video I posted on Facebook with Jonathan Pageau. It's a snippet from Jonathan Pageau and Father Stephen DeYoung, where they talk about how understanding Christ will blow away your concept of time.
Father David?
Yeah.
Is with Enoch, is it before, do we know, like, a good estimate, is it before Genesis and Moses, like, his writings? Because I heard it's, like, from the Ethiopian, they view it as, like, it's before Moses?
Yeah, so the text, always distinguish the text and the character, right?
Yeah.
The text of First Enoch and the Enochic literature, whatever you want to call it, really is something that starts to appear, as best as we know, from the 3rd century BC. It has a lot in it that textually looks like it's from a later period. Of course, it's about a character named Enoch, who is the 7th from Adam. So it's certainly before Moses, before Abraham, before even Noah. So the story is about things that both took place before all of that, but also most of it is an apocalyptic vision. So that's really important to realize. When the prophets are entering into an apocalyptic state, they're entering into the heavenly realm and seeing things from that viewpoint. Time is all messed up. That's why I was saying, go watch that thing and just to start thinking about how, what time is it in heaven? That kind of idea, like when you enter into eternal time. But nevertheless, my point, without going off the rails completely, my point being here, Bethlehem is in the land of Judah, right? But the one who's coming is to shepherd all of Israel. So as Jesus will say to the Samaritan woman, you worship what you do not know, but we worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. It's not saying salvation is for just the Jews. It's saying salvation comes through Judah, through the line of Judah, through the line of David, through Christ. Likewise, we see this in Matthew 2, farther down the chapter. When Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. Then he rose and took the young child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. Where did they go? Not back to Bethlehem in Judah. They went to Nazareth in Galilee, because that's part of the land of Israel from that northern kingdom. Okay, they don't go back to Judah. They go back to the northern area, which was not once known as the land of Israel. So you see this distinction being made territorially at this point. All right, but it's not, you wouldn't put on if you were getting mail and Nazareth, you wouldn't put such and such, Capernaum Street, Nazareth, whatever, Israel. You would put Galilee, right? So that was the technical address at the day and the time, right? But the people there who were from that lineage still would talk about it in terms of Israel, but with the recognition that that was the old way of talking about it, or the ancient way, and a different time. So it's a place also located at a different time in history. So when Christ says, when Jesus heard it, the centurion has the faith, that his servant will be healed. Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. You can read that in two ways. You can read that as, I've not met anybody in the last 3 years that I've been doing this public ministry in this region I'm in that had as much faith as the centurion. But that's interesting, but that's so what? When you realize who's talking and saying this, I have not found such faith even in Israel. This is the Lord himself saying, in the whole scope of the history of the people of Israel, I have not found such great faith. That's kind of what the point is that he's making, right? He's not just locating it in the moment, but in the whole golden era, so to speak, of the high times of Israel's faith. We see in the next chapter the same concept in the people. So when the people see that the demons are cast out and the mute person spoke, the multitudes marvel, saying, "It was never seen like this in Israel." So they recognize that they're living in a special time. Even though they're in the land of Israel, in Israel, so to speak, means the olden days, right? They never had it like this in the olden days. They never saw any miracles like this. And in Luke chapter 4, and many lepers were in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. So again, locating the past as a remembered time different from the present of the New Testament. That's another way Israel is used.
The irony here is that some of these stories are about the fate of Gentiles.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and Naaman is a Gentile, right? So that's yeah, exactly. And that's part of we're going to get to why that's happening actually, and why sometimes it doesn't actually. So, for example, we see continuing in Matthew chapter 9. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherd. So this is primarily the northern cities still that he's talking about. This is a mission to the land of Israel in the north. And when he says they were like sheep having no shepherd, he's not talking about the lost tribes as a people that disappeared and have gone off and become acculturated into the Gentiles, assimilated into the Syrians and the Canaanites and so forth. He's talking about those Israelite Hebrew people in that region who still live there, but don't have anybody to lead them. They don't have a king, really. Herod's not their, Herod is kind of maybe technically their king, but he's not one of their own people. Herod is actually an Idumean or an Edomite. They don't have their own shepherd, if you will, like David or one of the good kings. And so Jesus anoints the 12 apostles, right? He sends them out and commands them, do not go into the way of the Gentiles. Do not enter a city of the Samaritans. So even though they're in these areas where there are Jewish settlements or Hebrew language settlements and so forth, they also live next door to these other cities that are Samaritan cities, Gentile cities, like the city of the Gadarenes and the Gergesenes, with the swine. These different communities are all living kind of uncomfortably next to each other or in sight of each other, but they're kept separate, right? They don't live necessarily with each other like they will in cosmopolitan areas, like Antioch or Alexandria, which then becomes part of the apostolic ministry after Pentecost. He says, go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he's still talking about go right now. The mission is to the people who have remained faithful to the God of Israel. That's who we're talking to. We're not talking to pagans right now. Yeah.
How do they know? Could you tell just by looking at them?
They probably had some clothes that would have indicated, what they wore, their language. You see that when Peter comes down and at the trial of Christ, they identify him because of his accent. So, there's this recognition that there are some cultural differences, and of course, when Jesus comes to the woman at the well, she recognizes that he's a Jew. So somehow there are some cultural distinctions, and a lot of it probably is clothing. If you look at again, I'm drawing on my Eastern European kind of background. It's really popular now. The peasant blouses. Really, it's kind of a cultural exploitation, because a lot of these patterns are unique patterns to very specific regions And it was one of the ways that people could identify who you were. And if you've ever studied that, like you can tell right away the difference between a Georgian and Armenian and Azeri, just by slight differences in how the jewelry lies and how the dress is cut and things like that. So yeah, that's definitely part of that.
I recently read Dracula, reread Dracula,
Mhm.
as part of
Doxicon.
my prep for Doxicon. And one of the things that Bram Stoker is very, very careful to do in those early chapters, when Jonathan Parker is in Transylvania, is to describe very clearly the clothes and the cultural attributes of the various different ethnic groups. Because
you would. That's how you you could tell at that time the difference between Hungarians, Germans, Romanians, and Gypsies in Transylvania. Those are the four main groups. You'd definitely be able to tell them apart, partly by their look, even a certain amount of their ethnic look, but also their clothes.
Also Slovaks, he had Slovaks.
Sure, yeah, that's also neighboring. So in any case, this is all happening. This is a very interesting and diverse region, but they have a very specific mission at this point. And he continues to tell them, when they persecute you in this city, flee to another, for assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So this means these northern cities. He's not talking about Jerusalem and Bethesda and Bethlehem and down south. And note here, this was translated in English, in this English translation, you will not gone through the cities, which sounds to us like, we drive through a city. It's like no big deal. What the Greek verb there is telesite, which is from that word telos, purpose, and perfection. So it means you will not have completed the cities. You will not have finished going through the cities. And another way you could use that is like in a harvest, right? You will not have completed your harvest of these cities before the Son of Man comes, which means when the revelation of Christ as the Messiah is complete with his passion, death, and resurrection. Continuing the northern ministries, you see also this kind of distinction being made in the story of the Canaanite woman. This is always a hard gospel to talk about and preach. It always comes in the Byzantine lectionary right before the beginning of Great Lent, perhaps to teach us something about humility. Jesus went out there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon are coastal cities dwelt by Philistines, the progenitors of, say, modern Palestinians. Palestinians identify themselves not as primarily Arabic, as in from Arabia, but actually the descendants of the Philistines. So the word Palestine, Philistine is related. Behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region. So it's a Philistine city, but Canaanites dwell there. There's if you remember our giants battle talk, there's that whole story of how the Canaanite giant clans went to places like, I think, Gath and Tyre and Sidon and dwelt with the Philistines. That's why Goliath was fighting for the Philistines. So she's descended from this group of people that were like the most at odds with the Israelites, right? Going back all the way back to Joshua. And she cries out to him, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. So this woman is pagan through and through, but recognizes that this man is known to be a miracle worker and a healer, and she desperately wants her daughter to be saved. But he answers her not a word. And the disciples came and urged him, saying, send her away, for she cries out after us. But he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So again, this principle of first we work with the faithful remnant that has been left throughout all of these ravages of history, and we'll prepare them, and then you will see what happens after the coming of the Son of Man, where now it'll be opened up to people like her. But even so, there's the kind of the hint that it will be that case, because what happens, right? She says, yea, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table, and completely humiliates herself, really, making it clear that she's not just asking as like a pagan, thinking your God is good as my God, so why don't you help me out? Like that's the kind of the magical thinking of the ancient world. If I can't get it from my God, I'll go to the next city. Maybe their priest will do something and their God will do something for me. She's really humbling herself and saying, I subject myself to your God. And so he says, woman, great is your faith. Let it be done according to your word, to your desire. And her daughter was healed at that very hour. So it's a very powerful story about humility, but also kind of revealing the nature and character of God in his plan to redeem also the Gentiles. And immediately after that, we read that Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, went about that region. It's Decapolis as well. Went up on the mountain, sat down there. Great multitudes came up to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the mute, the maimed, and many others. And they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. And so the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. These four characteristics, I mean, it's not just like saying, what are the different ways people could be disabled in the ancient world? It's a very specific list of afflictions which are tied to the sign of the Davidic kingdom. Because David, when he drove the Jebusites out of Jerusalem, he said, they will because even the disabled people resisted. He said even they will not be allowed into my city. And now Jesus, as the Son of David, is reversing that. It's tied to that first part of that chapter with being called the Son of David. He's reversing what David did by allowing them, bringing them in, and healing them and making them whole. So it's a very interesting parallel that's going on there, and it would have been understood by the people seeing and hearing it put that way as a sign of the advent of the Messiah, as a revelation that the Messiah had come, and these are signs of the Messianic age. And of course, they glorified the God of Israel, right? That's the key. That's what made the people the people. We're going to talk more about that in another class. These apostles will become the new patriarchs. They will play a role similar to the 12 tribes patriarchs. The founding patriarchs, they become kind of new patriarchs, if you will, for the people of Israel. So Jesus said to them, assuredly I say to you that in the regeneration, in the resurrection, all right? Get some water. There's water in the fridge. God bless. So when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, judging the 12 tribes doesn't mean looking down your nose and saying, you guys are really naughty. Bad on you. Shame, shame, shame. That's what we think of when we hear. This is going back to that idea of justice that we had in the last chapter, which is God, the 12 apostles are participating in restoring the good order and righteousness of God's original plan for the 12 tribes of Israel. That's what justice is. It's restorative. It's not, I'm punishing them for doing bad. It's, I'm putting them back in the right order. I'm bringing them to justice, which is God's righteousness, God's original plan. And St. Paul will later say, do you not know that the saints will judge the world? That's the job of the saints. The apostles start with the 12 tribes, but then all the other saints, their job is to play that same role of restoring justice to the rest of the world, to whatever nations they're from. So, for example, Warren asked me the other day on Sunday when I said about how we celebrate the Holy Archangels on Election Day, and that's a good thing. What about Americans? Does America have a patron saint? I said, I think it's St. Herman. He's the first sanctified saint of America. He was a missionary to Alaska, and he's kind of been given this role in the eyes of the church by the guidance of the Holy Spirit as this humble monk who just cared for the least, who took care of the native peoples and the Aleuts and defended them against the depredations of colonial Russians. So It's that's an example of a saint judging the world in his own lifetime by seeking justice and restoring justice for God's people. And of course, in the age to come, it's even more so. This connects us, though, to the idea of Israel as part of a kingdom, right? It's all about being around the throne of the king of Israel, or the God of Israel, who is enthroned at the center of all this. So Jesus is understood as the king of Israel. We see that this is used against him in mockery at the time of his passion. In Mark 15, likewise, the chief priests also mocking among themselves with the scribes said, he saved others, himself he cannot save. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Clearly, they didn't believe that he was the Messiah or the King of Israel, so they were mocking him. But it's kind of really quite a blasphemous thing to say if you believe what was anticipated with the Messiah. To even try to take that in vain would be pretty bold, pretty reckless of them. Likewise, in Matthew 27, we see that if he is the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross. We will believe in him. He trusted in God. Let God deliver him now if he will have him. For he said, I am the Son of God. So they recognize that Jesus is making the claim to be this figure. And they're, of course, rejecting him. And St. Peter judges the 12 tribes of Israel as one of the 12 apostles immediately after Pentecost, when he starts preaching the gospel. And when he is brought before the Sanhedrin, which are the judges, right? They are the ones to judge him. He says, well, who's it right to listen to, men or God? As for us, we'll listen to God. And so he turns the tables on the Sanhedrin and he judges them in this sense of restoring truth and justice to the situation. He says, the God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom you murdered by hanging on a tree. And remember, we talked about that last couple of weeks ago. Him God has exalted to his right hand to be Prince and Savior, to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins. So he is the Archegon, which is translated here as Prince. It's fine to translate as means ruler, but also with the idea of the founder, the originator, the kind of the source of strength for the people. So he is the OG king and prince of the people of Israel. And again, to give repentance to Israel means not just to these figures in Judea, but the entire concept of what it means to be part of this people, Israel, God's people, Israel. And we're going to talk more about that. What does it mean to become part of God's people, Israel, over the course of this chapter? St. Paul will talk about his earnest desire. His heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. But St. Paul recognized that was not necessarily going to happen, in the sense that there was always clearly this idea that there is the faithful remnant, and that was before even Christ came. There was these periods in the Old Testament where there would be apostasy, but there would be a faithful remnant. In the time of Elijah claimed to be the only one left who was faithful, and he wasn't, but he felt like he was at the time, right? So St. Paul's desire was for all of Israel to be saved, but he also recognized that there was this difficulty of those who had rejected the Savior, rejected the Messiah, would not necessarily be part of Israel, spiritually speaking, at that point. And so he says, for I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. We're going to talk about this verse more in another class, because this idea of the fullness of the Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles and their fullness, is really important to understanding what's happening in the New Testament. And so all Israel will be saved, he says. But wait, he just said in a previous verse that there would only be the remnant saved. So now he's saying all Israel will be saved. What's going on here? As it is written, and he's quoting Isaiah from the Septuagint, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. Jacob, again, symbolizing all of Israel. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So his atoning sacrifice is going to cleanse his people Israel, and so they will experience this. But we shouldn't read this as a kind of a universalism for somehow all, and some people do, right? They'll read this as saying this means that regardless of what Jews believe or think, God is going to come and save all of them. So, which is a very bizarre teaching. I don't know if anyone says it that bluntly, but that seems to be the mindset in certain sects that you see, Protestant groups. And so they're like, whatever Israel wants to do is fine by us, because, and it kind of like throws out the whole thing that's going on in the New Testament with like the faithful remnant and understanding the role of God's people.
And I'll just add that when you encounter those people as a Jew, it's pretty creepy.
Because they love all over you, right?
Yeah, they get this like crazy look in their eye.
Yeah.
They're kind of obsessed with it. It's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's kind of it's bad theology, basically. Yeah.
Quickly just explain that one more time, because I've wondered about what you're describing, like why certain Protestant people seem so obsessed, just that I didn't get that explanation.
Because they don't have what you're going to see over the course of this, with spoiler alert, over this chapter, is that they don't understand New Testament ecclesiology. So when they hear about Israel in the New Testament, they assume that means anybody who identifies as an Israeli today or a Jew today. And they don't understand that there's 2,000 years of history going on between then and now. And that at that time, who Israel is becomes extremely important in the New Testament. And St. Paul is talking a great deal about who Israel is, and that Israel is not just a genetic inheritance, right? It's not just a racial designation. It's actually a faith and ritual designation. And we're going to talk about how that actually plays out over the course of this chapter. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to say, stay tuned. Sound good? A lot of it has to do with this, the new covenant. We read in Hebrews, for if the first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. If the first covenant worked, there'd be no need for a new covenant. Because finding fault with them, the Lord says and he's now quoting the prophet Jeremiah, so he's quoting the scriptures to them. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So the covenant that was the old covenant, which you could say, does that also include Abraham and Noah as well as Moses and through the Exodus? I don't know. It's a good question we could go into. But I will make a new covenant with them, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. Okay, so that is important. That is about the covenant with from the Exodus. Because they did not continue in my covenant, and I disregarded them, says the Lord. This is sometimes translated as like I was like a spurned husband, like I turned away from my wife. And that's actually a major kind of metaphor that's used throughout the Old Testament, right? Is that God is the husband and Israel is the unfaithful bride. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days. So it's, again, the broader definition of the people of Israel. Says the Lord, I will put my laws in their mind and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. This is the language that you see in the book of Revelation. That there will be no sun or moon because God will be their light, because God is their God and they will be his people, right? It's this fulfillment of the relationship of God to his people. We're going to talk about this in our catechism class in a couple of weeks when we talk about the church. When we say as Orthodox Christians, I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, because we do. That's part of the creed. To believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We're talking about we believe in one wife, of God, one faithful wife. And that is also part of the story that we're going to be looking at without getting too far down the rabbit hole. This will be fulfilled at Pentecost. So that whole section that we have coming up on Pentecost is going to show you how the new covenant begins and is starting to be fulfilled in the New Testament. Israel, properly understood as well, is a unique nation in the history of nations. If you go back to our earlier classes where we talked about the angels and the fall of the Tower of Babel, for example, well, you will remember these passages from Deuteronomy. Do you thus deal with the Lord, O foolish, unwise people? Is he not your father who bought you? Has he not made you and established you? This is important. He made you. Not just like at the beginning of time. He made you at a different time than all the other nations. You're a new nation on the earth that didn't exist before. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of your many generations. Ask your father, he will show you. Your elders, they will tell you. When the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations. So at the Tower of Babel, the nations were divided into all their different linguistic cultural groups, right? And instead of being kind of one people. And he separated the sons of Adam, and he set boundaries of the people according to the sons of God. Masoretic text later will say according to the sons or children of Israel. But the Septuagint, which is reflecting, and the Dead Sea Scrolls show that the earlier version of this was according to the sons of God, meaning the angels. So the nations were apportioned to all the angels, and then those nations began to worship the angels as gods, and that's what caused idolatry to flourish in the world, etc., etc. He separated them, but for the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the place of his inheritance. So God portioned all of the nations to the angels, but he then created a new nation to be his portion, to be his inheritance. This is important too, because remember, we use this language. We had it in the service tonight, and we sing it every time we sing the hymn of the cross. O Lord, save thy people and bless thine inheritance. This is drawing on this language going all the way back. He found them in a desert land and in the wasteland, a howling wilderness. He encircled them. He instructed them. He kept them as the apple of his eye, or literally the center, the pupil of his eye. So Israel, properly understood, is not like any other nation of the world. It doesn't have a patron angel watching over it the same way. Later, you'll see that kind of Archangel Michael is identified as the angel fighting for Israel. And then even really the Lord, though, is the one who fights for Israel. That's the real understanding. But they are created to be a new people, different from all the other nations. And through that people, God will then draw all the other nations to himself. That's their purpose. Their purpose is not to be nation number 71. Big deal. So what? Another nation, another group of people, another religion, another country, another language, another culture. That's not the important reason for their reason for being. Their reason is to be the Lord's portion, so that through them, the fall of Babel, of the Tower of Babel, the division of the nations, the confusion of the tongues can all be brought back together again. Because that was not a good thing that happened. This also has to do with who God is. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me. So this I am in Hebrew is Eyeh, which is, how do you want to explain that? It's like, it's not, I mean, it's translated as I am, but it's like, it has to do with being, right? It's a being who is being. It's kind of a bizarre idea. And, but the idea, it's related to his very name, Yahweh, which can be translated as, he who is, but also he who causes to be, he who brings into being. So when you hear at the end of Vesper service, Christ our God, the existing one, that's one way of translating it. Sometimes you'll hear me say, Christ our God, he who is blessed. If you were to say that in Hebrew, we would actually be saying Christ, our God, Yahweh, is blessed. Because that's what we're actually saying in that verse. And if you were looking at it in Semitic or Aramaic languages, that's how that would actually be said.
You can say exist in Hebrew. Hayam exists.
Yeah. But there's something going on here that's like it's more than just I am, right? It's
less than I am. It's I that I.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah. It's this weird construction
Yeah.
that is kind of intrinsically mystical, if you will. And then it has to do with being itself, right? So St. Peter then will take all of these concepts about this new nation, God who creates a new people, and he will use it when he's talking to the churches in his epistle. Now, it's interesting because scholars have debated, was the first letter of St. Peter to a Gentile church or to a Jewish church? My theory is it's to a mixed church, because by that point, that's how it was working. It was people evangelizing. It wasn't so strictly defined, right? It was these nations in Asia, these cities in Asia Minor where he's writing these letters to, are mixed communities of people, which grew out of synagogues and then brought the message outside of the synagogue to the people around them. And he talks to this group of mixed people now. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. He's using the language reserved for ancient Israel, his own special people, right? His special portion, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. He's using that kind of Deuteronomy language. You were not a nation, but now you are a nation. You have been created a new people to become God's holy nation, his royal priesthood, fulfilling that purpose of healing the world, bringing it to light, etc., etc. And we'll take a look at that as well. All of this is just teaser for the rest of the chapter, so I'm sorry I'm going through it very fast. We go back to Abraham. We can talk about Abraham. Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you. You shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, which is related to Abiram. It's kind of a short version, like Mike to Michael, I guess. Abiram, which basically means exalted father, or my father is exalted, or my father is God, the high God, right? You could look at it all those different ways. But no longer shall you be called exalted father, but your name shall be Abraham, which extends it and adds it in so that it's father of many. Not just exalted, but the father of many. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. So this is interesting because God creates his one chosen nation, his portion out of Abraham, but at the same time, many nations will come from Abraham. Now you can look at that and say, well, kind of plural nations came out. Not only did Israel come out of Abraham, but also Edom came out of Abraham, right? Moab, the Ishmaelites came out of Abraham, and out of Lot, you have Moab and Ammon and other groups. So certainly out of the descendants of Abraham, there are many ethnic groups that are created. But it seems that it's talking about more than just like 3 or 4 people in the neighboring territory, right? It's suggestive of really a great multiplicity.
Can I just point something?
Yeah.
Also, the name, the Tetragrammaton, the name for God, the Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh,
Yep.
as you hear, has 2 H's.
Yeah.
And when Abram and Sarai get new names, they each get 1 additional letter, and it's a Hey.
It's a Hey.
Cases. So they take a letter from the name of God in both cases.
That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
So in case you didn't hear that online, did you hear it? Zoomers? Are you asleep? So Abraham and Sarah both, from Abram and Sarai become Abraham and Sarah. So they both get that extra letter. which come from the name of God. That's really cool. Yeah. And it's through that seeding, pun intended, right? The seed of Abraham will go to become this source of many nations. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you and their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and your descendants after you. So that's the covenant. I'll be your God. You be my people. The covenant assumes I'll be faithful to me if you be faithful. I'll be faithful to you if you're faithful to me. And also, so the sign of that covenant is that I will give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So a lot of people make a lot of hay out of like the promised land needs to be promised and needs to be kept, and that's why the nation state of Israel is formed. And that's up for argument and debate by many people. I don't really have a dog in that fight, but my only point is that that's the outward sign of the covenant. The real covenant is the relationship between the two. It's not like, okay, you gave us this and now we get to keep it forever no matter what. The faithfulness is implied in that. And if the faithfulness is not kept, what happens? We see. They're kicked out, they're exiled, they're conquered, they suffer defeats. The book of Judges. I mean, it basically, it all goes downhill. I mean, Joshua comes in and the book of Judges is basically, it's like the Mad Max era. It's the collapse of the Bronze Age. So it is really an apocalyptic, in a different sense of the word. It's a societal collapse period. It's a savage period where there's a lot of raiders and a lot of danger and a lot of conflicts, and things just get worse and worse and worse. And that's why they say we need a king, because this is falling apart. We want a strong man to defend us because this is getting really chaotic, and that's Saul's put and so forth. But the kings also create a cycle of downward until eventually the kingdom is lost and the land is lost. That's why the Lord can say, don't say I have Abraham for a father, right? God can raise sons of Abraham from the stones, right? It's not, we shouldn't approach it from an entitlement point of view. But here we get the promise to Abraham reiterated in a later chapter, Genesis 22. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, and remember that when we see this capital angel of the Lord, this is Christ. This is the second person of the Holy Trinity talking to him. By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing and not withheld your son, your only son, Isaac, right? He was willing to sacrifice Isaac. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So one of the things we're going to look at here is, how is that fulfilled? How do the apostles, and in particular St. Paul and so forth, how do they understand the seed of Abraham seeding all of the nations eventually in a way that they will be blessed through Abraham's seed? That becomes a really important thing for understanding what is happening in the New Testament, what's being fulfilled there. So that's our class for tonight. I know I probably am leaving you with more questions than answers, but that was kind of the point. Like I said, this is just the introduction to this stuff. We're going to look at each kind of, for like the last, 14 slides or something, like each two slides is like going to blow up into a whole class. All right, with those topics, because there's 7 sections to the chapter. And I hope you enjoy it.
So what do we do on Thanksgiving?
All right, hold on a second. So again, for people on YouTube, if you enjoy the class, consider supporting the parish. Visit our website. And as always, like and subscribe our YouTube channel. All right, I'm going to